The doctrinal determinations of the 4th century, along with all of their immediate theological ramifications, rendered many of the established metaphysical premises upon which many Christians, being good Hellenes, had long relied in order to understand the relation between God and the world. Increasingly, that is, the Nicene definitions of God, rendered these understandings increasingly irreconcilable with their faith, and at the same time suggested the need to conceive of that relation, perhaps for the first time in Western intellectual history, in a properly ontological way. That is, at one time it had seemed natural for many Christian thinkers to imagine God and the world as somehow part of a single continuum, with the inaccessible Father mediated to the world below through the subordinate agencies of the Logos and the Spirit. In this scheme, in diminishing degrees of divinity. Subordinationism was the term for this way of thinking of the Trinity. In such a scheme, of course, the tragic interval of classical idealism, the impossible chasm between the divine truth and its earthly shadow, remains in place. God is himself the eternally inexpressive fullness of light, which puts forth only a derivative and reduced manifestation of its power in the divine Son, and then only a distant and defective representation of that power in creation. But with the gradual defeat of subordinationist theology, and with the definition of the Son and then the Spirit as co-equal and co-eternal with the Father, this entire metaphysical economy had implicitly been abandoned. These new theological usages, this new Christian philosophical grammar, did not entail a rejection of the old Logos metaphysics, but it certainly did demand its revision, and at the most radical of levels. For not only is the Logos of Nicaea not a lesser manifestation of God, of a God who is beyond all manifestation, he is in fact the eternal reality whereby God is the God he is. There is a perfect, proportionate convertibility of God with his own manifestation of himself to himself. And in fact, the convertibility between the Father and the Son, their co-equality, the Father perfectly mirrored in the Son and delighted in the light of the Spirit, is nothing less than God's own act of self-knowledge and self-love in the mystery of his transcendent life. Gregory of Nyssa is one who wrote about this rather beautifully. So, for that matter, is St. Augustine. His being, therefore, God's, is an infinite revelation. His hiddenness, his transcendence, is always already manifestation. And it is this movement of infinite disclosure that is his being as God. The relations of Father to Son or Spirit and so on are not in addition to other more original personal identities or in addition to the divine essence, but are the very reality by which the persons subsist. Thus the Father is eternally and essentially Father because he eternally has a Son. Basil of Caesarea lays this out very beautifully. God is Father, Son, and Spirit, and nothing in the Father exceeds the Son and Spirit. In God, to know and to love and to be known and to be loved are all one act, whereby he is God and wherein nothing remains unexpressed. The Son is the eternal and infinite icon of the Father, perfectly known and loved and illumined in the infinite glory of the Spirit. And there is a perfect equality without passage through negation or tragic alienation or estrangement of eternal beauty and its eternal expression. So it's within this understanding of the divine nature that Christian theology has to make sense of the second outpouring of God, the free, gracious, unnecessary, but eternally fitting act of creation. For the gift of creation occurs within the mystery of that infinite act of love and knowledge as a further expression of its beauty, brought forth not from some limited or limiting medium, but purely from nothingness, purely as grace, purely as a gift of the infinite within the finite. The beauty of God in creation is not something impressed upon this external and unformed ely or materia prima, as say it would have been even for someone like Plotinus in the Neoplatonic tradition, requiring a reduction of the unseen transcendent beauty to the distorting constraints of finite visibility. The experience of the beautiful that awakens us with such special force to the difference between being and beings, that awakens us to the sheer fortuity of transcendent beings' revelation in things, is also a revelation of the originally and ultimately peaceful economy of being. It tells us that between infinite beauty and finite beauty there is no conflict, no dialectical tension, no betrayal of the divine. Rather, divine beauty is that transcendent truth of being in which creation graciously participates and which creation discloses again and again as pure grace. Now, this, though, I want to take this one more step and then I'll finish. It's not just the doctrine of creation that determines this Christian aesthetics or metaphysic of beauty. It's the implication of Orthodox Christology, Orthodox small o. Well, now let's make it a big O. Just really especially as you find it explained by Gregory the theologian, that is Gregory Nazianzen, and Cyril of Alexandria. In Christ, one sees the difference between the divine and the human as an infinite qualitative distance, precisely because there's no conflict or rivalry between Christ's divinity and humanity. The latter participates in the former so naturally that the one person of the Son can be both fully divine and fully human at once. If the difference between God and humanity were merely a quantifiable difference between different kinds of beings, the incarnation would be a real change in one or both natures, an amalgamation or a synthesis, but then actually Christ would not be the God-man, but a monstrosity, a hybrid of natures that in themselves would remain opposed and unreconciled. But because the difference between the divine and the human really is an infinite qualitative difference, the hypostatic union, that is the union of both natures peacefully and fully and completely and inseparably in the person of the Son of God, involves no contradiction, alienation, or change in the divine Son. Because the difference between God and creation is the difference between being and created beings, rather than a tension between two poles within a single continuum, the there above and the here below, Christ is not simply some irresolvable paradox fixed within the heart of faith. In his one person, both God and man, there is neither any diminishment of his divinity nor any violation of the integrity of his humanity. And so one glimpses in him at once both the perfect ontological difference, the difference of divine transcendence from created beings, but also the perfect fittingness of the divine image to its archetype. For the perfect man is also God of God, not a fabulous demigod, but fullest, human in the fullest sense because divine in the fullest sense. So the beauty of the historically incarnate Jesus of Nazareth perfectly reflects and discloses within the fallenness of time the true beauty of the Father. To see him is truly to have seen the Father. To see him with the eyes of faith is to see within his very humanity the true beauty of the infinite God. This means then that the Christian understanding of beauty, we're working on premises here that the pre-Christian, that the classical world, for all of its insight, could not quite go as far as. The Christian understanding of beauty enjoins us to see the beautiful in those places, those regions of reality from which a conventional scale of appreciation of the pleasurable would exclude it. The form of Christ inhabits at once a province of shadows, the province of glorious light. He is at once nocturnally and diurnally beautiful. His is at once, at the same time, a way of abasement and a way of exaltation, and these two ways are one, not two different moments within the paradox, not a before and an after, but a venturing forth of God towards creatures and a return of creation to the Father that is one motion, one life, one dramatic action, that overcomes the fallen world's defining horizon, death, not through reconciliations with its limits, but through an infinite act of kenosis and glorification that transgresses it, passes it by as though it were nothing. And so, to sum up, that means that Christ's life is not one of temporary concealment and then a dramatic unveiling. Okay? It's not alienation followed by reconciliation. All Trinitarian theology depends on the belief that Christ's self-outpouring is not separation, descent from the otherworldly fullness of the divine into the non-divine, but a manifestation of the one eternal act by which God is God. It turns out that the relation between the form of God and the form of the slave that we read of in Paul, the morphe theo and the morphe doulou, is not one of dissemblance, but an ever deeper revelation of the depths of God. The story of the Son's incarnation, life, death, resurrection is not a masquerade, a great circuit, the exiled prince returning to the estate he's abandoned, like the great Gnostic hymn of the pearl. Finding his true self again only in returning to his distant home. The Son goes forth because going forth is always already who he is as God, because all wealth, poverty are already encompassed in his eternal life of receiving and pouring out this already accomplished life of bliss and love. He is hidden in being manifest and manifest in being hidden. God in both his divestment and glory. As the Gospel of John makes clear, Christ's crucifixion is also glorification. It is being lifted up upon the cross that draws the world to him. So even in God's dereliction, God's infinity is made manifest in the agony of Gethsemane, for instance, in going into the region of death. Christ shows that the divine simply surpasses these separations without in any way changing. Let me just make this clear. I mean, this means that the divine beauty has no proper place. It doesn't belong to a hierarchy within being and just at the top. A purely idealist metaphysics of the beautiful can, as I said, point in only one direction, away from the world towards the simple and transcendent source of all beauty. But Christian thought, with this Trinitarian premise, has to follow the path of beauty outward into the world, even into states of utter privation, even into states of deformity that still cannot conquer the radiant form of God. God ventures even into the godless, and even there his beauty is still gift, delight, and love. So this, I know that this is a rather diffuse reflection because I'm trying to unite 4 different essays into one address. But I would have to say that this, I think, is the most radical and precious gift of Christian aesthetics. It's not that it's entirely absent, say, in classical aesthetics, but it is a new and wider and broader and deeper revelation of the sheer vastness of the beautiful. It is the eye of charity, which relentlessly but joyously finds beauty even where we would not expect it, and even among the despised and rejected. The vision of love that invites and compels us to find the whole glory of being in the brokenness and the humility of a crucified slave. It's a new depth of vision, a new apprehension of the inexhaustible scope of divine glory, a perfect unity of kenosis, self-outpouring, and plerosis, filling up, of consummate weakness and omnipotence. From a Christian perspective, the event of the beautiful is an experience, even if only fleetingly, of this love that is forever poured out in all and that leads back to the inexhaustible wellspring of love. This way of seeing is finally possible only for the saint, who is the truest of true aesthetes, the truest connoisseur of eternal beauty in its infinite gratuity and boundless generosity. It is an understanding of beauty and a cultivation of vision that transforms all of reality into icons of the transcendent, windows into the eternal. Most of us enjoy such visions only in fugitive glimpses. Our spiritual senses are neither so refined nor certainly so sensitive as they should be. We must rely on, say, painted icons, the sacraments too, taking them as foretastes of an entire creation transfigured by the divine glory, but also all the arts, to the degree that they can show that forth. Even so, insofar as we have eyes to see and ears to hear, in the event of Christ's presence in time, we have been given, and are given ever anew, the knowledge of the beautiful in its eternal truth, which is infinite love.